Hello and welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Hope you've had a chance to go to CounterPunch Plus and get your subscription. That is the way that you support CounterPunch. That is the way that you get access to all of those great features, all of those great columns we used to have in the print magazine, all available for you and a lot more over at CounterPunch Plus. And by the way, if you didn't get in on our fund drive, now would be another great time to donate to CounterPunch to keep us going. It's been 30 years. We hope for at least another 30. So we really appreciate all of your support. And of course, we appreciate all of those great voices on the left that we are privileged enough to publish and to provide. So one of those is with me today. It's Kali Akuno. He is a regular on this show, I guess, at this point. Kali is a co-founder of Cooperation Jackson, such an important political initiative going on in this country. He is a co-author of a brand new book that I really recommend everybody get copies of, Jackson Rising Redux, Lessons on Building the Future in the Present. The website is cooperationjackson.org. Make sure you bookmark that one and make sure you donate to Cooperation Jackson. Kali Akuno, welcome back to CounterPunch.
Pleasure to be here as always.
Thank you so much. And as always, you're one of the people I lean on for this kind of analysis, both in terms of what's going on in this country, but also how we build alternatives to what seems like a collapsing system. So let's talk about Jackson, Cooperation Jackson, as an alternative. I think we probably want to start by sort of leading our listeners into what this thing is. Not everyone has heard of it, not everyone knows what it is. So Kali, what is Cooperation Jackson?
Yeah. Um, Cooperation Jackson is a vehicle that comes out of a particular strategic framework. I want to start there because we'll come back to that, I think, in a little bit. But it's a product of the Jackson Kush plan. And it is the division of that plan, which is rooted on creating a solidarity economy with its aim towards building economic democracy as a prelude towards a socialist transition. Now, that's a mouthful. And what it looks like on the day to day and in the real, uh, it starts with our base foundation, which is a community land trust, the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, which has over 40 properties, commercial, farming, and residential. And that is our baseline, right? And then the other core division of what we do and what we have are several interconnected and interdependent worker cooperatives. And so there's a green team cooperative, which is like lawn care. There's a Freedom Farms, which is kind of, in many respects, like the flagship. There's Zero Waste. And then there's the Community Production Cooperative. So those four, basically, when I say interconnected and interdependent, we've tried to specifically design them to work in complement with each other, to be a part of kind of the carbon cycles, very concretely and directly, to try to reduce, use and consumption and recycle like all the organic material to the greatest extent possible that we can to kind of regenerate the soils and keep a vibrant kind of local economy based upon a certain level of food security with the aim and objective of making our community food sovereign. Now, the long-term piece of what we're striving for, just so folks are clear, we're trying to advance a model wherein, we can do to scale a complement of local-based use production, right? Producing what we need for our immediate community based upon the resources available in our community, but then also have enough of a surplus that we can sell to kind of external markets to be able to both garner some income and bring in some more capital to extend and expand upon the projects that we have. Uh, we've been going at this now for 9 years, right? So we're still a relatively young organization. And, we've made, I think, some very significant strides in the objectives that we've set out for ourselves, but we got a long way to go. And, just to try to, we'll get various phases of the talk today. But one of the things about talk about the book, one of the particular pieces about the book, the Jackson Rising Redux, is to share in our direct experience. Because what we want folks to be clear, number one, we want more projects out there, in the United States, but out the world, following a similar course of development. Because what we need to do is create, our own value and supply chains to be able to kind of create a real alternative and not just some local one-off kind of project, however well it may be doing, in our environment, right? Because we are very clear, and we'll talk about this also as well. A project like ours cannot exist in isolation. It can easily get crushed, right? And so this is to like spread the gospel, if you will, try to get more people to both understand the challenges of what it takes to try to put on something like this, not as a thing to scare anybody off, but to just be real with folks about how hard you're going to have to work, how many capitalist, socialization, you know, uh, um, uh, points of orientation, socialization, worldview that it really takes to do something different, right? And to try something different, new set of social relations. It's not easy, and we wanted to convey that message with the encouragement of getting folks to take up this task wherever you may be, but to not do so naively, not to do so blindly, and to not repeat some of the mistakes that we've made.
I want to talk most of our time today. I want to focus on things that are going on right now and in the very recent past. But since we are starting with the origin of Cooperation Jackson, can you just tell us a little bit about who Chokwe Lumumba was and what
Mm-hmm.
role he played in establishing this model, or at least opening the space for this model, and how Cooperation Jackson evolved after his passing?
Right, right. Well, let me put us all like in a particular frame. The Jackson Kush plan is a particular uh, stratagem, if you would, that emerges out of the New African Independence Movement. And for those of you who don't know, that the New African Independence Movement is one of the particular kind of tendencies that comes out of the Black Liberation Movement. It's a tendency within this movement, which is old as the movement itself, which is based upon kind of situating, people of African descent on a solid land base, primarily located in the southeastern portion of what is now the United States. Uh, and to the aim and objective, as a basic through line for all the different kind of forces and tendencies, is to attain a level of self-determination for Black people. And this is just kind of one of many strategies developed over the course of time. This one is just, I think, through a course of a lot of work, a lot of trial and error in Mississippi, specifically over a 50-year period. That Chokwe was one of the people instrumental in kind of executing over that 50-year period. Just got to a particular level of maturation where that movement was, our movement was able to kind of test some ideas through the electoral arena. And one of the things that in 2008 we really wanted to test on the heels, just so folks are clear about some of the history, on the heels of our work in primarily in New Orleans, but in throughout Louisiana and throughout Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina. A couple of years after Hurricane Katrina, when we were starting to see the long-term structural and political impacts that it was going to have on our communities, and we wanted to kind of extend that to challenge some of that, but also to test out, like I said, our ideas. Like, how after 50 years of organizing, how resonant were our ideas? How popular and acceptable and palatable were they to the people in our community at large? And so to get in the electoral arena in many respects was a test of that, right? And, to be clear and specific, because I want folks to know the history, which is important, Chokwe and myself, we were both members of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the New African People's Organization. Those are organizations that he founded. I kind of came on as a, junior member some years later. Uh, but we come out of that particular struggle. And in 2008, myself and Kamal Franklin, I want to give him respect and props. We were the co-anchors at that time of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And many of you may know Kamal for some of the key principal work he's doing around Cop City right now in Atlanta, Georgia, keeping this struggle and the legacy going forward. We were very clear and determined to try to test these ideas, and we put forward to Chokwe, hey, we really want to test some particular components of this Jackson Kush plan model, in particular the electoral component, and we think you should run for office. Now, to his credit, Chokwe initially said no, right? He was like, no, I don't, not particularly want to do that. And I think that's clear because it speaks to a certain level of both integrity and political principle that he was pushed first by us, and then once we put that concept out by the organization, and then later by the broader social movement that we had helped to build. And in this case, that you would call that movement was the Jackson People's Assembly, which had been around and been in existence basically really since 1991. But in that kind of phase in 2008, it had kind of really reemerged in 2005 to help service the needs of those who have been forced, basically, in exile from New Orleans and other southern, Gulf Coast communities who are now in Jackson and scattered, forcibly throughout large parts of the country, but mainly Houston, Jackson, Dallas, and Atlanta. That's where most of the folks who were internally displaced, where they wind up being. So that People's Assembly had been in motion since that time. And then we put the idea out, to folks in the community, said, basically, hell yeah, we need to do that. The time is now. These are some the clear aims and objectives that we had in the city to meet some of our challenges around, particularly around the chronic underemployment and the decaying infrastructure that existed in Jackson, which was well known then in 2008. We'll come back to some of where we are with that in shortly. Um, but this Jackson Kush plan, I want folks to know and understand initially the version that is now out that you can read in the Jackson Rising Redux and in the earlier work, that initially started as an internal document, right? That's something that we wanted to build. But then when we became clear that we were going to run Chokwe and that we were going to experiment with the blog complement of this plan, we put it out publicly. And so the plan called for independent electoral politics, building the solidarity economy. That is Cooperation Jackson's kind of lane, reason for being. And then the other thing was, building broad people's assemblies as a vehicle to engage and build participatory democracy in our community, direct democracy in our community. And the aim and objective there is to not be subject to the basic kind of mechanisms and limitations of bourgeois democracy, but to push it, to exceed it, to go beyond it, to start and elucidate and experience and execute a certain level of just direct people's power, right? And what is this people's power for? The people's power, in the one hand, we were trying to be very clear at that time that we wanted to blunt the repressive edges of the state, basically the police and their repressive role overall within the community, the role that they play in capitalism in general, and to try to knowing that a winning office and being in the mayor, we were very clear. We want everybody else to be clear. That gave us some governing power, but we made a distinction and still make a distinction between having a certain level of governing power from having state power. We did not have state power, right? And I don't want anybody being under the delusion that we did in Jackson or that we do now with Chokwe and Tar Lumumba. We have some governing power, right? And the state of Mississippi constantly reminds us, right? The Neo-Confederates, they constantly remind us that we don't have we don't have state power, right? And we can get to that later. But those were the basic kind of three components that this overall plan was executed with the People's Assembly trying to be the lead vehicle, right, to build this kind of power. And in the course of this, in 2008, we first initially put Chokwe out there, was trying to push him to run for mayor, but the Malcolm X grassroots movement had already committed to someone running for mayor. So we didn't want to go against our word when we said, okay, well, let's do a lower level experiment and run for city council. And in 2009, Chokwe won that council seat. But we were always clear, from the beginning that we wanted more of the executive power, right? And in Jackson, so folks know, has a strong person or a strong man mayor type of governance, which means, the mayor gets to he forms a budget and he gets to execute that budget. And our city council has a certain level of approval of the budget, and then just line item vetoes if they have a majority to block certain initiatives within the context going forward. But pretty much the whole execution, the framing of government is between him and the structures that he then gets to govern. So we wanted that particular power to be able to execute a broad program. We articulated basically what wound up becoming called the Jackson Just Transition Plan. That was an objective to try to make, the city a zero waste, a zero emission city, basically by 2030, with some core commitments that we were doing there. And then for, there to be some very structural changes in both procurement and in hiring and setting up a cooperative fund, as well as creating a department that would do some training and support level work from within the actual city, that would help to develop cooperatives. And then we wanted to try to change and articulate, like, basically a new framework for the governance of Jackson by creating a human rights charter for the city, as well as a human rights commission. And we wanted this human rights commission to really have some broad powers, but particularly the power to hire and fire, the police chiefs, and to basically take them to task for any and all violations executed against the community. Right. This was that blunting piece. And then, we were trying to, within this initial vision, trying to move to democratize as much as the city as possible in a direct way, right? And we had a phrase that we were going to try to make all the principal questions of governance mass questions, right? To do our part, our best, to use the kind of the microphone, if you would, of being in the mayor's office, to really be kind of an educator in chief, if you would, to just thoroughly explain to folks, hey, this is how your taxes are being spent. This is how your taxes are being raised. This is how this is, so folks could directly be informed and then intervene through the people's assemblies and through the Human Rights Council and Commission to be able to do that. And then the final ultimate expression of that, there were many things, but, just the kind of core pieces that I wanted to end was, we wanted to set the city up that over a course of time, we were subjected to a human rights budgeting process, right? That we would have as much of the budget as possible be subjected to a broad participatory framework of setting the priorities of what the city should allocate, its precious resources, its limited resources to, with an understanding that, a budget is a reflection of your values and your priorities, right? And so, like most cities, if you look at your, the most municipalities, the largest line item budget is the police, right? And I want that to sink in. So is that who is that, protecting, right? Who is that serving? For that to be the majority kind of expense, if you would, in the city. So we wanted to counter that. And so Chokwe ran on this platform, was elected basically on this platform, but unfortunately only had 8 months in office to execute any core aspects of that program, because he unfortunately died of some uh, mysterious circumstances, if you would. He died, they say, basically of a heart attack um, in February of 2014. So just a couple of years. He got elected in 2013. So less than a year into office, he died. He transitioned, and so we wanted to. This is those of us who myself and the cohort who started Cooperation Jackson. We wanted everybody in our community to know that was like not a one-off event, that it wasn't just a one-trick kind of a pony, that there was real, teeth and intentionality behind this plan. And so we were already taking steps to launch Cooperation Jackson, or something like Cooperation Jackson. We didn't have that name initially. And we were moving in that direction. And we were, one of the ways in which we were trying to emerge this, working with Chokwe, was we pulled together this piece called the Jackson Rising New Economies Conference. And that wind up being held in May of 2014, May 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And so we wanted to go forward. But mind you, this we started organizing and announcing this conference in October of 2013. So this was supposed to be like a big coming out of our broad kind of solidarity economy program and platform that we had the city council already lined up to approve. In fact, the day that Chokwe died, there were two major things that were on the city council's agenda to be approved. One was a public works director. And for us, so I want folks to know at that time, public works was the largest line item, kind of budget, largest sector of the budget. So again, talking about the priorities, I think the city at that time already had some of its core priorities in right perspective, by that being the largest and trying to deal with our immense, and decaying infrastructure. That was well known already then. But somebody we wanted to put in there who came from our political orientation, came from our framework. He was going to be nominated and approved. We had already, Chokwe was a master at knowing counting the votes before we actually had the city council votes. I think in all that time there was only one vote we ever kind of got surprised by, and that was kind of a very intentional effort by a block of folks on the city council uh, to try to balance some power. So we kind of, we didn't like it, but we kind of understood what that was about, right? Uh, uh, and then kind of negotiated. But he knew all beforehand, long before he put something up, by doing one-on-ones. Chokwe did one-on-ones with every city council member for at least an hour every week, right? Trying to be, and the point is trying to build a broad consensus, right? And like actually demonstrating, trying to practice democracy. Hey, let's put everything, like on the table, and then the certain kind of rules. He couldn't pull them all together in side meetings because it's against the principles of, having secret meetings and all that kind of stuff. But I want to just give folks a perspective of what it is and what it looks like to try to do more radical kind of governance within the limited confines of a bourgeois, order, right? And so that the day that he died, Willie was supposed to be he was going to be elected to run our public works department, and then this whole proposal that I had laid out of creating, this revolving loan fund, this educational kind of department, and then some new policies and regulations in and around both city procurement and hiring. All that was going to be approved. But unfortunately, he died before the city council meeting, and neither one of those ever saw the light of day. So, knowing this, Cooperation Jackson, we say, was born prematurely, right? Because we wanted those particular things in place to give a certain level of both material support, but also, some infrastructure kind of capacity to the initiative. So, Cooperation Jackson was born without that, and we often say was kind of born somewhat prematurely, but we pressed on nevertheless to keep advancing the Jackson Kush plan. I think we made the right decision. Definitely, it made us encounter more challenges than we had originally envisioned. But I think we learned more from doing those types of having to face and deal with those types of challenge of not having any level of municipal support and having to go our own. Gives you a deeper appreciation of, you know, with any kind of municipal regime, what to ask, or why to stay away from it at different times, and being clear strategically. And I think we've kind of come up with a certain level of mastery of that in the course of our 9 years. But that's in short, uh, uh, you know, the basic kind of birth story of Cooperation Jackson, and where and how Chokwe Lumumba was directly involved in its construction.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that question because I think that, I've heard many interviews with you and others that are part of your circle, talking about Cooperation Jackson, but I think that sometimes what gets lost is the real nitty-gritty hard work of actually building all of this, because it's nice to look at it from a sort of 30,000 foot level, but you guys have really been in the trenches fighting localized political battles all along. And I mean, we've even seen some recently. I know, well, actually, before we go to the break, why don't you just tell us a little bit about, um, well, actually, let me ask you this question first. Before I ask about recent events in Jackson, why don't you give us a class-based analysis of Jackson? Because I think that many people,
Mm-hmm.
especially those
Mm-hmm.
people who don't live in the South in the United States, may have something of a distorted understanding of what the reality of Jackson and other cities in that part of the country as well, but Jackson especially, what it's really like. So tell us, what is it
Right.
really like?
Right. Well, there's a class and race analysis that you got to have to really understand Jackson. So let me start with a on the surface is the most obvious thing, which is Jackson is roughly 80% black, over 80% black. It's roughly about 50% quote unquote white, and then 5% roughly other, right? And that's Latino, Southeast Asian, East Asian, some migrant workers from Africa, primarily Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, some South Africans, and those particular groups of folks. Well, then there's a small number of indigenous folks, and there's a small number of what we call the Mississippi Chinese, which is a population that got brought in the mid 19th century to work on the railroads, right? After the period of chattel slavery kind of formally came to an end. So Mississippi was one of those areas that has a high and heavy concentration of Chinese immigrants who've now been here, 150 so many years, and have taken deep root, particularly up in the Mississippi Delta. So there's elements of them and their community which are here. Um, so you have that kind of racial demographic, then you have the class overlay, and so the black community is almost completely working class. Now, that is not to say that there isn't a black petty bourgeois force in Jackson. There is. And it is that force which fundamentally kind of it is the political class, uh, par none, in Jackson, right? And I would include some of our forces that were part of the Malcolm X grassroots movement to come from those particular kind of class strata. And we, were kind of very conscious in a sense, those who had that positioning of committing, or we had a program that was articulated around committing class suicide, following the logic and orientation of revolutionary thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, right, who was the leader of the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And I want to be clear because the folks to look up his works, they're now back in print. It's a new printing of Return to the Source, and it's definitely worth the read. But we were very much influenced, by his train of thought and that particular orientation as to what revolutionary-minded folks who are drawn, from that particular kind of class sector that we could play. That's not a vacillating role. It's not a, flip on and off role. To be very clear that we were making commitments towards the working class and having and developing the working class to be the principal leadership of Jackson, right, to move the politics and the community forward. Now, within that, you still also have to do some breakdown about what the working class actually looks like in Jackson. We have a working class which is chronically underemployed, and there are significant sections which are just permanently unemployed or which have never really had a substantive job. And we, have a lot of just hard evidence that we can point to, which says at any given time, right? Particularly over the last like 20 to 25 years, roughly about 50% of the community is either underemployed or unemployed, right? So that means there's some pretty entrenched poverty in the city of Jackson, right? Now, uh, you need to contrast that with another set of forces, right? And so Jackson has this weird dynamic from how it's played, how its development has played out, particularly since the 1980s. Well, actually, I would say since the 1960s, and that Jackson became a majority black city not until the 1980s. So places like Oakland, places like Baltimore, like Cleveland, as a result of the quote unquote Great Migration, they became majority black shortly after World War II, some even before there. And these were folks who were leaving from Mississippi, leaving from Texas, leaving from Oklahoma, leaving from Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, northern parts of Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia, primarily, and parts of Kentucky, heading to Chicago, to St. Louis, to Detroit, primarily to work in the industrial heartland areas that the U.S. empire had constructed, beginning back in the 1870s, right? Which had fully emerged in the course of their kind of development by the 1940s as a result of World War II and the kind of the post-war boom, where all of the United States core kind of economic competitors were taken off the scene for a while, that primarily being the UK, Germany, and Japan, right? So black folks who had come from these southern areas occupied the core constituencies of the working class, the industrial working class, for that period of about 50 years, roughly from 1945 roughly into like the 1980s, when a massive program of deindustrialization was intentionally pursued in the United States to break the back of the working class, but particularly the more radical sectors of the black working class that had clearly emerged and become politicized beginning in the 1950s with the highlight of the 1960s and 70s with the Black Liberation Movement, all the urban revolts that happened from Newark to Harlem to LA to Detroit, Cleveland, many places in between. These were striking major core areas. And then you had organizations that emerged on the scene in the late 1960s, to challenge, some of the deeply reformist politics that had emerged in more left forces from a generation before, like the revolution, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which emerged out of Detroit, what was actually a regional-wide organization that had a profound impact on the workers' movement for at least a generation, from the late 1960s into the late 1970s. Well, put that all in context in Jackson. Jackson was never Mississippi is an agricultural state at one point because of the nature of chattel slavery and the nature of the global economy in the early part of the 19th century. Mississippi was actually the richest state in the Union on the basis of slave labor and the export of cotton, tobacco, to a lesser extent, sugar cane to a lesser extent, indigo and rice, right? But mainly cotton. Cotton was king here. Uh, and that just produced a major fortune for the planter elite, that ruling class of Mississippi. Now, I went all that to say, to come back to talk to about a core constituent of Jackson that remains. So during the 1950s, the working class segments of Jackson, white working class segments, they left the community fairly early. They first kind of started to migrate when Jackson started to become black to South Jackson. So if you go to Jackson, you come in Jackson, and you look at kind of the uneven development, right? You'll see like a lot of just loosely, poorly construed houses that were kind of built up there. Most of them are still occupied. But why are they there? Why this infrastructure is the way it is? Because it was a certain level of working class white flight into South Jackson that then built it. But then as black folks, were forced into those communities, by the kind of the planter elite, which not only runs the plantation, but owns most of the property and industry and retail things that exist in Jackson still to this day, forced the black community into West Jackson, into South Jackson. And then that resulted in the white working class communities primarily moving over to Pearl, uh, parts of Ridgeland to the north, and to Flowood. These are the communities to our east. And what that left, and what you have in Jackson is the white community that is there is very affluent, extremely affluent. So you have, uh, in some respects in Jackson, when people come in, I often give them a tour, right? Like the Tale of Two Cities tour. Like this is our side of town. This is how we live. This is what's going on. But before you just think it's all, you know, deep Mississippi poverty that you didn't kind of heard. Like, no, no, no. There's tremendous wealth here. Do not be confused. Rather than take them to other areas, like, no, you see mansions that would rival anything that you might see in the lifestyles of the rich and famous in LA or up in the Hamptons. Like, it's right here. Don't be confused that you might not see it. It might not be portrayed, but those of us who live here and have to come to terms with this nature of class struggle that actually is existing, we know where this wealth is, and we've known where it is because a lot of our grandmothers, right, used to work in those places as nannies and maids and in those things. So it's not something that's unknown to the black community. It's very known. So you have this weird kind of contrast in Jackson of a very affluent, white community, a deeply impoverished black community, and then this kind of unstable black petty bourgeois class, which, is trying to negotiate between these two dominant class forces, right? To manage the city and to try to like take off some of the spoils that come off of the tax base on the one hand, and then what exists and can be uh, um, kind of either appropriated or granted or extracted from the larger apparatus of the overall dominant economic engines within in Jackson and the industry there. And I want folks to understand it so we can then move on. Jackson is a transport hub. Again, I said, remember, Mississippi is primary agricultural state. But Jackson, number one, you got to understand, it's a city that was intentionally constructed to be a midpoint of transportation along the Mississippi River to move goods and services from Chicago to New Orleans and from Atlanta to Dallas, Fort Worth. That is what Jackson is, fundamentally as a structural entity. And that was first articulated by its relationship to the Mississippi River and the barges in those systems. And then Jackson is on the other end of another river, the Pearl River, which defines its eastern border. And the other component is the later construction of that, which was the railroad. So Jackson is at the intersection of a whole network of railroads that got built basically from the 1830s, roughly until like the 1950s. A whole intersection of just railroads that go there that connect you to the river. And then the latest infrastructure that got laid on that was through the urban renewal or Negro removal programs, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And that's the freeway infrastructure that got built. So Jackson is one of the major transport stops along the 20. And the 20 is a freeway that basically goes from California all the way, over across the country. Where does it end? It ends, I believe, in South Carolina. Uh, but the major point, like again, is the major stops along the 20, going from Dallas is Shreveport, then Jackson, right, and then Macomb, then Tuscaloosa, where the University of Alabama is, then Birmingham, and then Atlanta. So you see this kind of just this route of major kind of political sites, but also major historical industrial sites and the movements of these goods and services. So Jackson's economy is really structured around moving agricultural goods from the Delta and like wood and other stuff from the eastern portion of the state, and then shipping it off, right? And then the other kind of core component of what Jackson has grown to become as the state's capital is the seat of where most of your federal, state government kind of institutions are housed, and then all the services that come around that. those are the things that structure Jackson's real economy. And then there's spinoffs around the trucking, the transportation, and then the underground economy, particularly sex work, which is a feeder to that trucking and transport industry. So that's to give you a real picture of what we're contending with and the space in which we're trying to like organize and transform for our community and move a broader, socialist agenda.
And part of the reason why I think it's important to get that kind of an analysis is because although there's obviously a lot of particularities for Jackson that are unique to Jackson, at the same time, many of those phenomenon that you described absolutely apply to many cities
That's
across
right.
this country. I was in Schenectady, New York last weekend. Schenectady, New York, former industrial city. Albany, New York, similarly have many of those same trends from the 1970s and the 1980s, leading to the sort of post-industrial, hollowed out poverty that you see in a lot of sections in places like Schenectady. And I'm
That's
saying
right.
that because that's where I was on Sunday. But I mean, there's many cities like that, of course. At the same time, Jackson is also unique because of the obvious history that you're alluding to here. And we're going to take a break right now. But on the other side of the break, I want to talk about some of the events and some of the drawbacks that you've seen and some of the events and situations that have developed in Jackson in the last couple of years that I think illustrate some of the struggles that you're talking about. So let's take a quick break, go over, get yourself a copy of Jackson Rising Redux, Lessons on Building the Future in the Present. While you're listening to the break music, go order that book, and we will be right back to continue our conversation with Kali Akuno here on CounterPunch Radio. And we are back chatting with Kali Akuno. CooperationJackson.org is the website. You can go over to the website, make a donation. Make sure you do that. Support this kind of work because not only is it important in Jackson, but as Kali was saying in the earlier part of our conversation, it's really important as establishing a potential model, something that can be not only adapted and built upon, but can be sort of used as a starting point. I think that's really important. Every region, every city, et cetera, has got its own unique circumstances, and Jackson is, of course, no exception. Kali, tell me a little bit about recently. There was a big, headline grabbing story in Jackson about the water
Yeah.
system in Jackson. This made national headlines. Of course, I think everybody knows in recent years, a lot of talk about Flint, Michigan, but Jackson kind of flew under the radar with COVID and many other things that were going on at the same time. I think it's really important to talk about not only the story that came out, I guess that was in 2021, 2022, but also how that relates back to those public works that you were talking
Hmm.
about at the very
That's right.
beginning of all of this. Because I know in our prior conversations that we've had, you talked about the importance of modernizing the water infrastructure and fixing this decaying infrastructure. That hasn't happened, and here we are 8 years later, and Jackson has a severe water crisis. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, last, the end of summer and the beginning of fall, so the end of August, beginning of September, Jackson's water system just basically collapsed. Now, what triggered this particular collapse was some unprecedented rain, right, that we were having last summer. Uh, Jackson, the living expressions of climate change in our area is that the seasons don't add up anywhere. If you look at a farmer's almanac, anybody familiar with doing any farming knows the farmer's almanac gives you the seasons and when to plant, what's best to plant, etc. Well, a lot of the information is now obsolete because the climate change has already majorly adjusted the seasons in our area, and we now have what we consider real winters. Some of you listening in the north might laugh at us, but we are now on the regular are getting hit by these deep polar vortexes that typically come in now the end of January through February and parts of March, and leaving snow and ice, that sticks. Jackson has a history of parts of the South will sometimes get a little snow, but it typically doesn't last a day, right? It melts. Not anymore, right? It sticks around for weeks. And you got to recall, we don't have the infrastructure. Like, we don't have the stockpiles of salt. We don't have the plow machines to move stuff off the roads that you might find, like any place north of St. Louis, I would imagine, right? We don't have that. And there's no plan or resources to acquire it because it's still not totally construed as being normal. And the other thing now, it rains more often, instead of like rains typically being in April and May. They're occurring more frequently in August and July. I mean, August and September and into October, right? And then in the summers kind of move more to like August, September, October, right? Not May, June, July, August, like not that period. And so this last year, we just got inundated, and the officials like Chokwe Antar, actually the mayor, Chokwe Antar, did a actual press conference 2 days before like all the systems just basically collapsed and the pumps stopped working, to tell people that they should evacuate certain areas because they were going to flood. So we had knowledge that this was going to happen because we've been well aware for probably 20 years now that it wasn't just a matter of if the system was going to really collapse, it's a matter of when. And the narrative that gets portrayed, particularly by the governor, the present governor of Mississippi, is, these black folks don't know how to manage anything, right? They don't know how to govern. Well, if somebody comes and tells you 2 days ahead, I would move or go look for a hotel, you know, does it mean that they maybe made some mistakes? Yes, but they know enough and are trying to get enough to manage a crisis to just not leave you in the lurch, like what happened in New Orleans, like with Hurricane. Just to give with Hurricane Katrina, just to give you a contrast, and because the contrast was there, the hurricane came and went, right? What destroyed New Orleans was the flood after the hurricane, when the people did not get a warning about all those levee breaks. Well, warning was issued. Like, that lesson definitely learned by our forces, of which in this case I would definitely consider Anton one of our forces. And knowing that history, wanted to give a heads up. Now, why and how? Because the system has been systematically deprived of resources for 30 years. Particularly the last 10 have been particularly vicious, as the governor, Tate Reeves, has been in control over the key levers of the allocation of resources to municipalities. First, now as the governor, but before he was the governor, he was the lieutenant governor. And what he was able to do as a lieutenant governor for an 8-year period before becoming governor was basically block every request from every mayoral administration around allocation of resources from the state to fix and repair Jackson's water system. So this is what resulted in what is going on now, because it's not, I don't want to give anybody the impression that just because we have the pumps are functioning now, that our water is clean or that anybody should drink it. They should not. Now, some people are in a situation because of resources, the poverty I mentioned earlier, that they really have no other choice. But the system is not fixed, and we still have a major crisis on our hand, which is being aggravated by the nature of how the U.S. constitutionalism functions and works. And what do I mean by that? So in this case, we have a sense of the price tag, and we've had a sense of the price tag of what it would take to repair and overhaul the system in Jackson, the water system. And the basic, bill for the last like 4 or 5 years has been coming in between like $6 to $10 billion to fix and repair, to do an overhaul of the system, which is actually needed. Now, keep in mind, Jackson's annual budget, no budget has ever gone over what uh, anywhere close to $1 billion. I think the largest one was one of the budgets that we instituted, which was close to like $800 million, right? Which is a borough budget, a fraction of a borough budget in New York City, right? So just give folks a perspective. So I wanted people to have a sense of that, because you're talking about, if we spent every penny for the next 5 years, we still wouldn't, of our city's total budget for the next 5 years, just trying to repair the water system, you could do nothing else and you still wouldn't have enough money, right? Given how money is allocated right now, what the budget is. So this is only going to really be, dealt with if there's some resources that come from the state, of which they should, since Jackson is the capital of the state, you would think, and from the federal government. Like, those are the only entities that really have that level of immediate resources to move around. So Benny Thompson, the congressman, the black congressman for the state of Mississippi, during the last kind of special appropriations before everybody went out, for all the representatives and senators went out for their winter break, he kind of pulled off a minor miracle and was able to basically secure about close to $1 billion to repair Jackson's water system. Right, he did right by the city. I don't know what all the mechanisms were, but he tried to do right by the city. Well, guess what? Because that money cannot be directly allocated to the city, even though that was the stated purpose of how it was secured, the state of Mississippi has enacted a series of laws this last, legislative session, to basically steal 80% of that money to reallocate it where the Republican Neo-Confederate supermajority wants it to go, not to the city of Jackson. So they have no intention on alleviating this crisis, is what I want everybody to be clear about. And so
Hey,
it's
Callie.
going to
So
go on.
sorry about that. I just got a message about your microphone. Is it possible? Can you see if you can? Do you have any programs running in the background? It's telling me that. Let's see. Kali Akuno, their high quality audio stream from microphone has stopped. Kali Akuno should check that their mic or interface is functioning properly. Close any non Zencaster software and disable browser extensions that might be blocking the audio. I've never seen that message before. I've used this a million
That is
times.
weird.
Do you have anything running in the background that you could close?
No.
Oh
Uh,
Jesus. I don't know why all of a sudden. All right. What
that is interesting.
Cali participant failure, high quality audio stream from microphone. All right, I don't know why it's doing that. All right. I'm
I'm
gonna
trying to shut down as many things as possible. So I got some PDFs and stuff open, but
oh yeah, I don't know. I mean, it looks like it's still recording. I'm not getting that message anymore.
yeah, it's still. I'm looking at the line. It never stopped recording.
Yeah, I don't know. All right, I'm gonna cut all that out in editing. We're gonna see what happens.
Okay.
Let's just keep it going. We're already almost an hour into it. No reason to
Okay.
stop now. But if something happens with the audio, I'll let you know, and we'll see if what we can do maybe another time. But
Gotcha.
all right, let's
Gotcha.
let's 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 keep going. All right, three. Yeah. Do you know where you left off? I'm sorry, but I didn't
Yeah,
mean to
I
cut you
do.
off. Yep. Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah. So I want folks to understand that the Republican supermajority has no intent on resolving Jackson's water crisis, and this is very similar to the dynamic, which is structured around race and class, like it is in Flint. There are ready solutions that could have been done very early on in Flint to go back to the original water source, being the most obvious one. Um, and there is very clear what needs to happen in Jackson, and it's been clear, right? Our public works department has a very clear knowledge of what's broke, what needs to be fixed, how much money it would cost, and this is just being systematically denied by the state, either just by not allocating resources that the state itself controls, right, through the taxes and resources levy, or by the extraction and theft, and I mean that theft of the federal resources that are coming in that have been specifically been allocated to fix Jackson's water system. So this crisis is going to go on. And part of the reason I want everybody to be clear that it is going to continue is because they are trying to let me be very clear, the Tate Reeves and the super, the Neo-Confederate supermajority that runs Mississippi right now, they want to send a clear message and create a clear example of failure of our political project, to be a warning to anybody in any other municipality or social movement thinking otherwise. And they don't care if the city runs down over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, because it helps them on a certain level facilitate more people moving out of the city because they have to. So Jackson is facing, in my view, an existential crisis. Our project, the overall Jackson Kush Plan project, I think, is facing the existential crisis because, number one, which we didn't talk about, the city of Jackson has been shrinking over the last decade because of our, I would say, our infrastructure kind of collapse. That being the public schools, that being the roads, that being fewer jobs, like all these things. The city has already been shrinking, and when you get to a situation where you can't drink the water and your children can't drink the water because you're, fear of lead poisoning, fear of other contaminants, people are going to start making rational choices to move elsewhere. And they would have no problem with that. Depopulating the city, particularly getting rid of its black working class majority or weakening its black working class majority, means that folks like Chokwe Lumumba and Chokwe Antar Lumumba with their radical politics will not be able to get elected. So there's an intentionality to this that I want folks to be very cognizant of as to why this is being allowed to happen, why it's being perpetrated and extended in the way that it's being extended. There's an aim and objective here that the right has, and it's at our expense in trying to prove our model and our example to be a failure.
And it's more than just depriving Jackson of resources, isn't it? I mean, we read in just in recent months about the attempts to set up essentially a white controlled political, I don't know, what would we even
Yep.
call it? A white controlled segregated political parallel political system. How
Yeah,
would we
that's
describe
right. Well, we
what
call
this?
it apartheid. This is to
Yeah.
be clear so folks understand this is apartheid 2.0. And I want everybody to know the bill that we're referring to, or really with two bills kind of compressed into one, is HB 1020, and it passed, right? I want folks to know it passed. And the version of it that passed not only has a special kind of cutout zone, primarily reserved for the white richest, components of the community, but it gave special police and administrative power over the courts, over the whole city. And so I want folks to understand what that means is that now there's, and I don't mean this lightly, there's an occupying army that is being prepared to take over Jackson as of July 1st, when this new law that was passed, this HB 1020, becomes in effect. And it is being administered and will be controlled by the governor, not by the people of Jackson, who get to vote in their mayor, who's supposedly supposed to control the police, have some level of control over, not by the Hinds County sheriff, which is again somebody directly elected by the people in Hinds County, of which the majority of Jackson is situated. So it's the most anti-democratic expression of a power grab that you can imagine. And it should be being talked about in every corner of the left, in my view, because this is coming to you. Like the right is just perfecting how to, just denude the state constitutions and the American Constitution of any of the pretenses of democracy. Not that it was ever a great document truly about democracy anyway, but they are going to just strip it bare down to make sure that they can institute minority rule through all of the gerrymandering, all of the specific maneuvering around the courts. They are following and executing a grand strategy, and they are doing a damn good job of it at the moment. And we have to figure out how to regroup, rebuild the left, not on some paltry, uh, weak reformist agenda, but a real radical agenda that speaks to the vast majority of working class people and oppressed people in this country to move them in a different direction. And if we don't serve as an example of why that's necessary, I don't know where it does when you really look at it and examine it.
And speaking of, I mentioned Flint a couple of minutes ago, and it's interesting the parallel there as well, because we all remember
That's
when
right.
they brought in the quote unquote emergency manager to essentially act as a bureaucratic, technocratic dictatorship over and above a democratically elected government. And so
That's right.
it seems like, in a sense, Jackson is kind of like Flint on steroids here.
Yeah, it's just they're just stepping up their game,
Right.
right?
It's an evolution. It's a
It's an
natural
evolution,
evolution. Yep.
right? If they experiment, get away with it one area, come bring in some more pieces, get away with another area. So we are another canary in the coal mine, and it's coming to a city near you, right? And and keep in mind, I mean, one of the things that I think is clearly playing out, particularly since 2020 and the midterm elections, the 2020 elections. I think the right has now buckled down that it's not clear whether they have the numbers and the coalition to put either a Trump or DeSantis in the Oval Office. But they were never a one trick pony, right? And so, you had Mitch basically running for the last, 10 years in particular, and this is a strategy that precedes him by far, but he's executed masterfully, hijacking the Supreme Court and making it a bastion of reaction, right? With all the tricks of the trade that you can think of, eliminating all the old gentlemen's agreements about playing fair, has no intention on doing that. So he's hijacked the court, and this empire is going to have a conservative court if things remain as they are for the next 30 to 40 years. And then they're doing another excellent job with their constitutional convention strategy, right? And they now have a solid core part of the map of having the South pretty much on lock, and now increasingly most of the Midwest, and edging more and more towards the West, right? Arizona, uh, uh, New Mexico to a lesser degree, but Utah, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota as core areas of their kind of political base, and are very clear about effectively utilizing the already built-in undemocratic aspects of the U.S. Constitution to extend their rule. And what do I mean by that? Right, when you just look at many people tell you about the Electoral College, and that's again a legacy of slavery. It needs to be gotten rid of. But the other component of is this adoption of the class iteration of how this thing went down from their copying of the House of Lords into the U.S. Senate. And so there's no reason that a state like Mississippi should have the same voting power at the end of the day in the Senate as a state like California. And let me tell you why. Mississippi only has about 2.4 to 2.5 million people in it. There are more people in Brooklyn, right, than there are in all of the state of Mississippi. And Mississippi is bigger than Belgium and most of the Netherlands combined. It's not a small place, right? But what they've mastered is that land actually constitutes a vote within how the Senate is constructed, and they've mastered, like, we're going to take all of these states, that have kind of these low concentrations, these low densities, high levels of white, populations that are increasingly lean more and more towards the right, and consolidate them into a block to be able to secure enough. And they're at that threshold. They kind of been at this threshold now for like the past 60 years, where they're close to that kind of 30 state majority they need to call for this convention and then do a rewrite. And believe me, that is a real strategy. It's not some fiction. It's not conspiracy theory. This is a real strategy that the right is employing, moving more and more closer to, right, to be able to just have total control over the state apparatus, which is what they're aiming at objective. And they figured if we can't get it one way, we will get it another. So if they can't have it in the form of the president, they're going to have it one way or another. And it's driving this country further and further down what I've been arguing, as you know, Eric, further and further down a critical point of conflict, unresolvable conflicts that I think are leading this society directly to a civil war. And I've been putting that out for over a decade. And now, it is openly on the lips of many forces, many uh, uh, representatives. Not, they used to be the friends. They're now occupying the core governing component of what now constitutes or what's called the Republican Party. they are now the dominant players in this and pushing this agenda. So folks should be very aware. Don't take them lightly. Take them at their word. When they mean something, they mean, when they say something, they mean it. They may not have the ability to execute it, but best believe they are working towards its fulfillment, and they understand, how do you build momentum and how do you play a strategic long game much better than our forces do right now, unfortunately.
It's such an important point, and Callie, you bring it up, so I want to just expand it a little bit. One of the frustrating things and by the way, let me back up and say I agree with you entirely with what you just said about where the country is headed in terms of the divisions, the conflicts, the dynamics, etc. I agree 100%. And that leads me to this question, which may be slightly controversial, but that's okay. Some of the elements on the left, including people that I've been close to for a long time, in my view, have absolutely dropped the ball on this analysis and not understanding what the actual threat is coming from the right. Be
Mm-hmm.
part of this is, and you alluded to it earlier in the economic context, part of it is sort of the idea of black struggle as being centered in northern cities, right? And so and what happens then, and that is a very much a historic thing over decades, many decades, but what happens then is then all political conflict ultimately becomes structured around fighting against the Democratic Party, because it is the Democratic Party to a large degree that dominates in most of these cities that we would be talking
That's
about,
right.
whether Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago or wherever. And what happens then is that the analysis seems to miss what the right is today, because it's still fighting, quote unquote, fighting the last war. And
Right.
this
That's
is
right.
not to say that Democrats are our allies. They aren't. This is not to say that Democrats aren't part of the ruling class and part of the establishment and need to be fought against. Of course, that's all true. But I think that many sections of the left have really missed the threat that you're talking about. And I think to some degree, Callie, maybe it's because of your proximity being in Jackson and quite literally living up against these neo-Confederates, that we need to popularize this idea, especially among radical sections of the left, that hey, the Democrats are bad. They continue to be our enemies, but you really shouldn't sleep on these motherfuckers over here
Oh,
because they're going to
you
cut your
better
throat.
not. You better not. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, I've had two tours in Jackson, and this is my second and the longest. Um, and being in Mississippi definitely gives you a perspective. Being in the South definitely gives you a perspective. And I always frame it this way for folks that getting a chance to travel throughout the country. It was like, look, if you live on the coast, particularly like California, Oregon, Washington, like in the New York, New England kind of area, you got to be very mindful to not stay in the bubble that you live in. Because the vast majority of the country is not like this urban cosmopolitan. It's not that it's not diverse, but it's not New York, it's not Los Angeles, not by any stretch of the imagination. And the vast majority of people still live like in those kind of heartland areas, and they live in worlds which are not reflected, right? When they look outside of their window, what they might see on like a TV show like Friends, like that ain't what I see in Mississippi, nothing close to it, right? And so there's not much in the mainstream kind of liberal media that speaks to my reality, that is a reflection of where and how I live, right? Like if you just turn on most TV, I'm serious about this as a commentary to get people to think. You turn on most TV, you would think everybody in this country lives in a city, like a big city, right? And not like in suburban places or rural places. Uh, but if we don't think about them in mind and within the kind of the actual structural layout of how the power is practiced and designed in this country, you're like talking to the choir and not talking to those that you need to be figuring out how to be in some deeper alliance with. And there's been a great job of alienation of so many, like not just white working class folks, but there's just a lot of there's a growing conservative black movement. People better not sleep on that at all. that is reactionary as hell, right? And is perfectly aligned with some of this Neo-Confederate, Neo-Confascist stuff. That may sound crazy, but it is. And so having this proximity has given me a lens. But I'll tell you, and I just tell the audience, the thing that really got me to start really paying attention to this was in the early 1990s. I was a student in California, and I started doing micro radio, getting trained in doing micro radio, right? Setting up our own radio stations, our own networks. And I was trying to convince other leftists, hey, we need to get. Now, this is before I knew about the internet. I think before it became this big public, kind of utility in the mid to late 1990s. So this is before then. We're saying we need our own communication mechanisms. So I was going to just training after training all throughout California, parts of Oregon, in Nevada, for about a 4-year period, just getting trained up, getting the network. And you know what I started noticing then? It's like 91, 92. For every training I went to and tried to recruit like one or two people, the right, and I mean straight right, like Nazis, skinheads, Klans folks, like the ones in like Nevada and upstate California, they were all there. And they kept, every time I went, there would be like 2 of them, then 4, then 10, then 20. And I'm sitting there like, whoa, I'm just sitting there then like, we're getting clobbered here. And it just hit me even that far back. Like, I'm struggling to recruit my own people to see the value, the strategic value of having media that we can control ourselves and not be relying upon the CNNs or the commercial talk show radios and the commercial radio that we can have and put in our community. This other side clearly saw the value of it. And that just let me know, like, okay, if they are the only people talking to folks in certain areas and they have a platform for 5 years, 10 years, they're going to naturally move people in that direction. And what I saw them do being around them, like the whole format that you see, like Carson Tucker and all that. Remember, anybody old enough would know, like, the news used to be, I hate to say it this way, like the news used to be an actual, if you turn on CNN or NBC or CBS, they actually had reporters who were like on site, who like did things in the real world and gave you a narrative. It wasn't a group of folks, who had a picture or two of some scene somewhere and then just talk to you about it for an hour, right? And you may not know one fact about it. Like that is a format that Fox adopted from low microwave radio. And they started doing that. I watched it. They started doing that because they didn't have no resources, but they had a story to tell. They had some politics to get off and a worldview that they wanted to share. So they made up for lack of resources and actual content by just running their mouths. That became mainstream with Fox basically in the late 1990s. And they've used that formula taken from from the fringes, if you use that formula to build, they say it's weak now because of getting rid of Carlson Tucker, but they'll find somebody to replace him, fairly soon and redo the formula. But it's no accident that Fox is the largest, quote unquote media piece out there now from adopting this format, because Fox is built upon this infrastructure that it in part, I didn't know this till later, like them and the Koch brothers were funding some of these operations of these low microwave radios. So I didn't, it's like later on you start to do research, like, wait a minute. So I was, faulting my own organizing. Like, no, these folks was getting paid. You was out there volunteering, right? And if they can offer resources, then yeah, the more people will show up and make the training. But I'd be like, hey, you can get in my car and go with me. But I couldn't get anybody a bus ticket or a plane ride or anything. That's what they were doing, right? So this is a long-term strategy, and it's something that I think that's what started to get me to pay attention to it. And I consume, a lot and have for now, almost 30 years. I consume a lot of right-wing radio. A lot, y'all. And it's been paying attention to them over the years that I was just like, I believe them in what they say about their organized, because I've witnessed it with my own eyes, growing in its strength, growing in its power, growing, in its whole over people. And I'm old enough and been around long enough to know that y'all didn't have this kind of pole position 30 years ago. You've built that. Now you've had some major support of capital to get there, but still there's a tremendous amount of strategy and organizing that got there. But they always had this agenda. That's what I want folks to understand. Right? Folks have been pushing on their side, at least the folks I got exposed, they've been pushing race war for a long time, right? And so to me, it's no accident that here we are now, 2023, and you have somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about the Great Divorce, or Tucker Carlson talking about the replacement theory. Like I've been hearing that on right wing radio going back to like at least 1996, 97, both of those terms, right? So this has been, and people have just didn't take them seriously enough, and you can see it growing. Like people, I remember, doing work in the mid 1990s, and people didn't take Newt Gingrich, seriously enough. Then like in 2000, when basically the Bush team basically orchestrated a mini coup, and we just kind of went on like there's nothing happened. So they've been building and aggregating this power. So it should be really on a certain level no surprise. Like, and now everybody's kind of shocked to like to hear this stuff. Like, no, we allowed this to happen by not taking ourselves and taking them seriously, right? And following into like a lot of this liberal rhetoric. I gotta stop pretty soon. But it's this point, like, how many decades have we heard liberals say abortion would not be touched? I'm just using that as an example, whether you agree with it or not. This was their rhetoric. It won't be touched, and if they come after it, you know, uh, uh, we're going to tear up the streets, and then sit there and watch all these confirmations for the last 20 years, where they sit there and allow themselves to be lied to, listen to Gorsh and some of these other folks. No, I'm not going to touch abortion. Like, did you not read their papers? Did you not understand the society that endorsed him and what his position was? Right? Did you not? It's like how did you lied and alluded, gave yourselves illusions as to what was happening, what was possible, thinking that you were playing some gentleman's agreement and that was established fact. They have no established fact. They're about rule, subject us to their rule one way or another. Majority rules means nothing to them. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Most folks are still fighting the last war. And then the approach now that I see, which is also scares me to an extent, is like there's an awakening now uh, to like we got to do everything to fight the right in a way that just gives a lot more concession and power to the liberals. There also needs to be analyzed, right? And because what we're not doing sufficiently enough, we can fight the right and still build an independent politic, right? And that is not being focused on. And that's the part that scares me, right? Is that, we need to look at concrete examples of where this has happened before, and it has happened before, and it's happening here now. And we better take some serious heed to the lessons to be able to deal with the fight that's in front of us, not the
Absolutely.
one that happened before.
Absolutely. And I know we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to make one additional point in building on what you just said. One of the differences, of course, now from 30 years ago when it comes to the right is that the right, the far right, is truly global today.
That's right.
It was
That's
not
right. Thank you.
before. You did
Thank you for
not
bringing that up.
have a
Yeah,
far right fascist project that spanned the entire globe that has already captured state power several times over, whether you want to talk about Bolsonaro in Brazil or Orban in Hungary, or many other examples that you could point
that's
to.
right.
There is a global far right fascist movement, and that the fascist movement in the United States is in many ways incorporated into it. And in some ways, it's really interesting if you look at, just as one example, anti-LGBT legislation in Russia in 2017.
That's
That
right.
then got exported to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and many other countries, and many of those pieces of legislation about gay propaganda and
Right
anti-trans
now
propaganda
here.
brought to the United States now.
Right.
And so, in many ways, there is a sort of a cyclical far right fascist politics that's happening globally that is also feeding into our domestic far right.
Right. That's right. That's right. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a point I always. They have an international, we don't, and we need to be very mindful of that, right, in real time, and the work we got in front of us.
The website is cooperationjackson.org. Make sure you go there, give your donations. This is a project that absolutely is deserving of as much support as possible. The book, Jackson Rising Redux, Lessons on Building the Future in the Present. Follow Kali on social media. I know he's doing book promotion, book events. You've been traveling around. Find Kali, connect with him, get involved in the movement. What else can I say? It's so, so important. Kali Akuno, as always, thank you for coming to Counterpunch and talking with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Listeners, as always, thank you again for the continued support, and we will talk to you again next time.